Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and I'd like to welcome you to another in our series of conservation and community distance broadcasts, or sometimes we call it Conservationists in Action. And this afternoon we have a very distinguished speaker who's been here once before, about 2 years ago, and we're really pleased to have him back. We're having Robert McKracken Peck, who's going to talk in just a second about Paul Du Chaillu, and he'll tell you how to pronounce it properly since I butchered the French, and more importantly the discovery of the gorilla and the implications of that. Before I turn it over to Bob, I'd just like to give you a little of his background. Mr. Peck studied history and archaeology in college at Princeton. He's a fellow of the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. He's a writer, naturalist, historian, an excellent speaker. He's traveled extensively in North and South America, Africa, Asia, Europe. He's the author of A Celebration of Birds, Headhunters and Hummingbirds, an expedition in Ecuador, and William Bartram's Travels. He's written for a tremendous number of popular and scholarly magazines, and he's easily one of the most entertaining and visually stimulating speakers we've ever had out here. So welcome back, Bob. It's really a pleasure to host you again.
Thank you very much.
And I'd like to make one other announcement. We're going to, because it's such a visually rich topic, gorillas in their environs, and then the European reaction, we're going to have Robert run through the PowerPoint and show you all the images and tell you the story, and then at the end of the broadcast, we'd be happy to take questions from any of you in the audience.
Great, okay. Thank you. What's always fascinated me about this story is that it's so late in history. It's hard to imagine that it wasn't until the middle of the 19th century that people really began to study gorillas scientifically. We would assume that they'd been known for centuries before. But the timing of the discovery and its popularization by Paul Du Chaillu is what makes this story so compelling.
Oh, great.
So I hope you'll enjoy some of the images. I've been spending time gathering together wonderful cartoons and drawings and photographs from the period and bringing us right up to the present time.
Great. We look forward to hearing it.
It begins actually in Australia. On July 25th, 1865, the residents of Victoria, Australia, opened their copies of the illustrated Melbourne Post to find more than half of the front page devoted to the arrival of 3 gorillas from the wilds of West Africa. Mounted as a family group and displayed in their own glass case at the National Museum of Victoria, the taxidermied trio had been celebrities almost from the moment of their arrival in Australia a few weeks before. The Post's coverage of their display increased their notoriety still further, prompting thousands of curious citizens to visit the museum. Attendance doubled in the first few months of the exhibition. This gorilla family, long desired by the museum's director, Frederick McCoy, put Melbourne at the center of an international debate about evolution, the origin of species, and man's place in the universe. The gorillas had been collected near the Gabon River in West Africa by Paul Du Chaillu, an enterprising French-American explorer who had burst on the international scene 6 years before when he emerged from the fetid jungles of the Gabon to provide a startled world with 20 gorilla specimens and the first-hand accounts of observing the species in the wild. While a few gorilla specimens had been seen in Europe and the United States earlier, leading to the gorilla's first scientific description in an American journal in 1847, Du Chaillu brought the first really large collection of skins and skeletons and provided an awestruck world with the first real descriptions of their behavior. The earlier finds had been seen by a limited scientific audience. Du Chaillu would bring the beast to the attention of the public at large. In an era dominated by explorers whose names and bigger-than-life personalities will be forever linked with the map of Africa, men like David Livingstone, Henry Morton Stanley, Richard Burton, and John Hemming Speake, to name just a few, Paul Belloni Du Chaillu stands alone as an explorer whose fame was achieved almost entirely through the discovery of a single species of animal, rather than the geographical questions he was able to resolve or any national political influence he was able to exert through his travels. So sensational were Du Chaillu's accounts of the gorilla, and so effective was he at associating himself with them, that the two became inseparable in the public's mind. Together, Du Chaillu and his charismatic find became a sensation the likes of which the world had never seen before. That Charles Darwin had published his controversial theories on evolution just months before Du Chaillu's emergence from Africa no doubt added enormously to the impact of Du Chaillu's discovery, for it put the explorer at the center of a philosophical and religious debate that continues today in a few parts of the world, especially here in the United States, where, surprisingly, evolution is still as controversial an issue as it was when it was introduced by Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin more than a century and a half ago. Gorillas, or their images, in one form or another, still capture our imagination, even as real gorillas slip closer and closer to extinction in the wild. From the time of their popular introduction by Paul Du Chaillu, gorillas have been creatures charged with meaning on many levels, representing different things to different people. They are symbols of strength to some, symbols of gentleness and vulnerability to others. They have been turned into lovable children's book characters and scary monsters who represent the darker, bestial side of human nature, distorted mirrors of ourselves whose differences and similarities both threaten and attract us. That gorillas still evoke such powerful, if ambiguous, responses more than 140 years after they were first discovered by the Western world helps to explain why Professor McCoy was so keen to acquire gorilla specimens for the Melbourne Museum, and why they caused such a sensation when they first went on display there in 1865. Thanks to the care they received by the museum and the heavy load of arsenic rubbed into the skins by the taxidermists who prepared them, the three mounted examples of what McCoy called the greatest and most man-like of the anthropomorphous apes are still in remarkably good condition and still attracting fascinated audiences at the museum to this day. Most of the visitors who see them are unaware of the story behind their capture by Paul Du Chaillu, the man who thrust gorillas and himself into the white-hot spotlight of international debate a century and a half ago. For such a public figure, the author of 13 books and a man who could draw an audience of thousands, Du Chaillu's personal history is surprisingly vague. Various biographers have given his place of birth as New Orleans, Louisiana, the West Indies, West Africa, and France, and its date is anywhere from 1830 to 1840. It seems most likely to have been in Paris about 1831. His father's status as a trader and supply master for the French naval and colonial stations in the Gabon estuary in West Africa is well documented. Unfortunately, we know nothing about his mother. Du Chaillu appears to have had two sisters, but since there is no official record of his birth, it's quite possible that the boy was illegitimate. In any case, after 10 or 13 years in France, he joined his father in Gabon, where he received some informal education from American missionaries. As a teen, he may have been given some minor clerical jobs by the French colonial government. After 4 or 5 years of this, at the urging of his American missionary friends, Du Chaillu decided to start a new life in the United States. In 1852, at about the age of 20, he arrived in New York with a few letters of introduction and a valuable cargo of ebony wood. Through his network of friends, he found a job teaching French at a school for girls in Carmel, New York, where the students made fun of him for his diminutive stature and his poor command of English. He was apparently 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed no more than 100 pounds. He soon found that what set him apart from others and earned him some measure of respect from his students, fellow teachers, and Americans in general, were his experiences in Africa. Everyone he met wanted to hear about this colorful land and its exotic inhabitants, both wild and human. Du Chaillu was charming, resourceful, and a good storyteller who soon developed a reputation as an engaging raconteur. With the encouragement of his friends, he approached the editors of the New York Tribune and offered to write some articles about the Gabon. He also traveled to Boston, Washington, and Philadelphia, where he gained some attention from natural historians through his first-hand accounts of the flora and fauna of West Africa. In Philadelphia, Du Chaillu was introduced to the members of the Academy of Natural Sciences. at the time the nation's most respected and influential natural history museum.
Still is.
Thank you. Several of the leading members of the Academy expressed interest in having Du Chaillu return to Africa to collect examples of the little-known wildlife there for further study. And so, with both the academic imprimatur and the financial backing of the Academy, Du Chaillu embarked aboard an American sailing ship for the West African coast in October 1855. For the next 4 years, the young explorer traveled up and down the coast and inland to areas with which Westerners had very little, if any, contact before. Du Chaillu's earlier experiences gave him several advantages in this risky venture. He could speak many of the local languages, and he had friends and contacts among the missionaries, traders, and tribal leaders along the coast. These proved invaluable in enabling him to penetrate the unexplored interior, where he secretly hoped he might discover the sources of the Congo River. Du Chaillu's collections of birds and mammals pleased the scientists at the Philadelphia Academy, who even named some of the new discoveries after their discoverer. Du Chaillu sent hundreds of specimens to Philadelphia in exchange for the financial support the Academy had provided. But when he offered to sell some of his most unusual specimens to other institutions and private collectors, his relationship with the Academy began to sour. Of course, the biggest prize and the biggest bone of contention was the gorilla, which Du Chaillu quickly recognized would provide his opportunity to achieve both fame and fortune. When he made his triumphant return to America from Africa in the summer of 1859, after 42 months in the bush, Du Chaillu found a public eager to hear his tales of adventure, and especially eager to know more about the new species of primate he had seen and collected in his travels. Charles Darwin's publication On the Origin of Species in the very year of Du Chaillu's return helped pave the way for an even greater reception than Du Chaillu could have imagined. He honed his lecturing skills and toured the major cities of the United States with a series of hugely popular public talks. He also signed contracts with American, English, and later French publishers for a book in which he would spell out his adventures in riveting detail. When Du Chaillu traveled to England in the spring of 1861, news of his discoveries and his reputation as a public speaker preceded him. On May 11th, he was invited to present highlights of his African adventures at a special meeting of the Royal Institution, and a few days later made a similar presentation to the Royal Geographical Society. With the renowned geologist Sir Roderick Murchison in the chair, and such prominent personalities as Chancellor of the Exchequer and future Prime Minister William Gladstone in the audience, Du Chaillu addressed standing room only crowds of over 800 people per lecture. The consummate showman, he appeared on stage flanked by some 20 gorilla skeletons and mounted specimens, and with a set of maps and large illustrations of African scenery and wildlife. In his heavy French accent, he presented enough hair-raising accounts of his close encounters with each animal to simultaneously amaze, delight, and horrify his overflow audiences. When published a few weeks later, Du Chaillu's book, entitled Explorations and Adventures in Equatorial Africa, was an instant success. Though unusually large and expensive for its genre, it contained 480 pages and cost 1 guinea. The book sold more than 10,000 copies in Great Britain alone in the first 2 years in print. Seizing on London's infatuation with Du Chaillu and his gorillas, the satirical magazine Punch used it as the inspiration for the lead cartoon in its preface for the 1861 edition of the hugely popular publication. Here you see Punch himself introducing a well-dressed gorilla to a room full of previously discovered primates, who in this case represent the scientific establishment and the British public at large. In a long illustrated review in that year, the Illustrated London News declared Du Chaillu's book, quote, a very remarkable work for which ordinary terms of eulogy were deemed inadequate. And many other papers and magazines gave it equally enthusiastic reviews. Unfortunately for Du Chaillu, not everyone was as positive about the book or its author. Some questioned the geographical accuracy of the explorer's report. Some challenged the veracity of his descriptions. Charles Waterton, an eccentric naturalist and self-proclaimed expert on primates, dismissed as preposterous Du Chaillu's descriptions of gorillas, beating their chests or attacking humans with their hands. Based on his own experience in South America with New World primates, he could not believe that gorillas lived on the ground and supported themselves on their knuckles, or could stand on their hind legs, as Du Chaillu claimed. Waterton attacked Du Chaillu repeatedly with a series of vicious letters to the popular press, accusing him of outright fraud. "These are travelers' tales," wrote Waterton. "I don't believe Du Chaillu ever went beyond the coast." When it came to scientific fraud, Waterton knew of what he spoke. Following his return from the last of 4 expeditions to Guyana in 1824, he had created his own fictitious primate by cobbling together a number of animal skins and calling it a nondescript. What he had intended as a joke, to test a gullible public, took on more serious dimensions when he published a plate of the phony creature in his book Wanderings in South America in 1826. The scientific community, at first taken in by his hoax, was not amused by Waterton's sense of humor, and soon froze him out of their inner circles. This may be one reason that Waterton, who had once been respected as a naturalist and explorer, became so embittered and increasingly turned his scorn on others. A more credible critic of Du Chaillu, and a person in a much greater position of authority over his reputation in the scientific world, was John Edward Gray, keeper of the zoology section of the British Museum from 1840 to 1874. After what he considered an excessively favorable review of Du Chaillu's book appeared in the Athenaeum, an influential literary magazine, Gray launched a vitriolic attack of the book and its author, questioning almost every claim made by Du Chaillu, from his zoological discoveries, which Gray said were not new, to his geographical pronouncements, which Gray said were cribbed from others. Partly fueling Gray's venom was his personal and professional rivalry with his immediate superior at the British Museum, Sir Richard Owen. Owen was a highly acclaimed anatomist whose many achievements included coining the term dinosaur to describe the group of prehistoric creatures on which he became the world's leading authority. Owen had publicly embraced Du Chaillu's gorilla descriptions and championed his reputation as an explorer, at least in part in order to share some of Du Chaillu's enviable public visibility. Gray, in turn, attacked Du Chaillu and his sensational descriptions of gorillas in order to embarrass Owen, with whom he differed on many topics. So heated were the exchanges between Gray and Owen over Du Chaillu's discovery that a cartoonist of the period created and published a series of amusing caricatures of the two men duking it out in what became known as the Guerrilla Wars. Drawing parallels to great battles among the Greek gods, the accompanying text was creatively adapted from the 5th book of the Aeneid. Never far from the surface in these debates, of course, were the increasingly contentious positions on Darwin's theories of evolution that were dividing both the academic establishment and the public at large. Richard Owen, an anti-evolutionist, tried hard to reassure the public that there were significant anatomical differences between the gorilla and man. But others saw enough similarities to be made uncomfortable by the very existence of the gorilla. This was one reason that Charles Waterton, a devout Catholic, took such exception to Du Chaillu's descriptions of the gorilla as a bipedal primate who seemed to demonstrate human and even superhuman behavior. Gray pleased Waterton and Du Chaillu's other critics when he claimed that Du Chaillu's gorilla specimens showed evidence of having been shot or speared from behind, not from the front, as described and illustrated in Du Chaillu's heroic accounts. Du Chaillu's defenders said that the wounds were perfectly consistent with the explorer's claims. Gray's skepticism notwithstanding, several of Du Chaillu's gorilla specimens were purchased at a considerable sum by the British Museum, where they remain today. Within weeks of Du Chaillu's first lecture in England, almost every leading scientific figure with an interest in Africa or an opinion on evolution was involved in the debate. From Sir Richard Burton, as you see here on the left, who defended some of Du Chaillu's ethnographic and geographical claims, to Thomas Huxley, Darwin's champion, who, like Gray, seized on the guerrilla wars as an opportunity to criticize and embarrass Richard Owen. In the May 18th issue of Punch, under the heading Monkeyana, the editors ran this cartoon and a long satirical verse, ostensibly penned by a gorilla, in which the controversy surrounding the creature's status was distilled and wittily ridiculed. Although Darwin's theories were central to the debate over the gorilla's relationship to humankind, Darwin himself wisely refrained from public comment on the issue. Energized by the enormous popular acclaim he had received, and enriched by the sale of his specimens and by the commercial success of his book, Du Chaillu decided to make a second expedition to Africa in 1863. This time he would take the necessary scientific instruments to verify his geographical discoveries, and a camera to prove beyond doubt the veracity of his anthropological and zoological claims. He now knew how aggressive his critics could be, and he was determined to answer their charges with proof positive that what he had described in his book was true. Du Chaillu's second expedition, while far better planned and financed than his first, was plagued with difficulty from the start. Offloading his tons of equipment on the African coast, one of the tenders capsized, and the critical scientific instruments he had been so careful to take with him were lost. He requested more from England, but these would take many months to arrive. While he waited, he practiced his newly learned skills as a photographer, working with some live gorillas he was able to procure with the help of native suppliers. The photographs were successful, the first ever made of live gorillas in Africa. But sadly, his attempts to keep gorillas in captivity were not. Assuming such ferocious creatures must be meat eaters, he fed them none of the vegetarian fare they required. Young ones could survive on milk for a short period, but they too eventually died, though one was with him long enough to become something of a pet. His descriptions of it are quite affecting and provide a sensitive contrast to his terrifying accounts of the ostensibly ferocious adults. It was during the first 6 months of his second expedition, when he was confined to the coast, that Du Chaillu procured and shipped to London the gorilla specimens that eventually ended up in the museum in Melbourne. These may have been the very same specimens that Du Chaillu had photographed in Gabon. The female and juvenile of this group died within a few days of their capture. The male was shipped alive as a gift to the London Zoo, but unfortunately it died at sea a few weeks into the journey. Of course, Du Chaillu did not restrict his collecting to gorillas, for there were great demand for other specimens as well. Since he was no longer working for the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, Du Chaillu was now a free agent, collecting for a number of institutions and individuals worldwide. He used taxidermists and specimen dealers in London, Paris, and New York as his agents for the commercial sale of whatever he was able to procure. This ranged from the smallest birds and even insects to the largest mammals. His thrilling hunting experiences proved great material for his later books, as did his many encounters with native peoples. Du Chaillu already spoke a number of local languages and taught himself more. This proved invaluable in his investigations, which were remarkably thorough and sympathetic for their time. He was among the very first Westerners to encounter a warlike tribe known as the Fang. His colorful descriptions of their alleged cannibalism added enormously to the public's interest in his first expedition. On his second trip, Du Chaillu made an equally sensational ethnographic discovery when he became the first European to encounter and describe pygmies in their jungle fastness. His claims about both groups, while contested by some, were ultimately confirmed by subsequent explorers. While most of Du Chaillu's encounters with native people were peaceful, not all were. Sadly, his second expedition came to an abrupt and violent end when, in an unfortunate mishap, one of his party killed 2 members of the Ashango tribe. The Ashangos, understandably, retaliated. Du Chaillu and his men were forced to retreat in disarray, abandoning the explorers' precious scientific instruments and photographs. Discouraged and distressed by his hostile encounter and his own close brush with death from the wounds he received in the retreat from Ashango land, Du Chaillu left Africa in early 1866. He would never return. Du Chaillu had taken the precaution of creating 3 copies of his field notes and scientific observations. Fortunately, one set survived his disastrous experience. These notes provided lots of interesting detail for his next round of public lectures in England and America, and served as the basis for his next book, A Journey to Ashango Land, published in 1867. By the mid-1860s, most of his controversial claims from the first expedition had been confirmed as truthful, and his newest accounts of adventure were accepted without serious dissent. Du Chaillu's reputation as an explorer was now secure. A born storyteller, Du Chaillu would spend the rest of his life telling and retelling the stories of his travels in Africa. He published a series of highly successful books on this subject, including several aimed at adolescents, thus creating a special niche market for young readers. It would be hard to overstate the impact of Du Chaillu's writing on the public's perception of Africa. Not even David Livingstone and Richard Burton could match him in terms of numbers of volumes published and read. His books went into multiple editions and were available in public and private libraries around the world. Their influence was enormous and much too widespread for me to cover in detail this afternoon, but I'd like to cite just a few examples of the extraordinary ripple effect Du Chaillu would have on popular culture. Edgar Rice Burroughs' enormously successful Tarzan series is one obvious place to begin. Burroughs first introduced his Tarzan character in a cheap pulp magazine in 1911. This eventually led to 26 books, a popular comic strip, and almost 50 films. The books appear to have drawn heavily from Du Chaillu's descriptions of life in the Gabon, and we can only assume that Burroughs read and admired Du Chaillu's book as a boy, as did so many of his generation. He even adopted the memorable chest-beating gesture and high-pitched roar of triumph for his ape-like hero from Du Chaillu's accounts of guerrilla behavior in explorations and adventures in equatorial Africa. With little else available in print to describe life in West Africa at the time, it's not surprising that so many of Burroughs' images of Tarzan's experience are derived from Du Chaillu's writings. Du Chaillu's titillating accounts of gorillas attacking humans from the trees, and on occasion carrying off women, fired the public's imagination and may have influenced artists like Emmanuel Fremier, who created this powerfully evocative sculpture of a gorilla and its human victim, a bronze casting of which was recently exhibited at the Tate Gallery and the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., in conjunction with an exhibition on Henri Rousseau. The first version of this sculpture, seen here, was created in 1858, the year Du Chaillu returned from his first expedition to the Gabon. This one was later destroyed, but the idea stayed with the artist for the rest of his life, and he created several other versions of the same subject, including the one I showed first, which was made in 1887. The same concept, let's see if I can go back. here. The same concept was adopted by H.R. Hops when he created this lurid but effective recruiting poster for the U.S. Army in World War I. Here we see Du Chaillu's bloodthirsty gorilla transformed into the militaristic German Kaiser, complete with spiked helmet and bushy mustache. He wields a bloody club in one hand and holds a despairing woman who personifies civilization in the other. With Europe in ruins behind him, the brute now ominously threatens American soil, thus presumably inspiring patriotic Americans to enlist in the armed services. This may not rank with Fremier's sculpture as a great work of art, but as a piece of propaganda, it is extraordinarily effective. Other graphic artists, working on both sides of the political divide in World War I, adopted gorilla-like images to demonize their enemies. Norman Lindsay, an Australian artist, created this grisly poster on behalf of the Australian government in the final years of the war. While Julius Engelhard of Germany made this one in the turbulent years following the armistice, when anarchy was the country's greatest fear. The caption here reads, "Distress and ruin follow anarchy." While Du Chaillu never illustrated a gorilla carrying off a woman, and only reported the phenomenon as something he had heard about from native informants, the concept was so horrific and erotically charged that it was the one seized upon and remembered by everyone who read the books. The image became something of a metaphor for Africa as a whole. The artist of this whimsical poster, advertising the Uganda Railroad, included a woman kidnapping gorilla as part of the local scene. The poster was issued in about 1909. Of course, Cooper and Cusack used the same powerful idea as the premise for their classic film. Let's see, what happened here?
Back one.
There we go. I'll go back. Yes, there we are. Their classic King Kong in 1933. Only in this case, the oversized gorilla who so terrorized New York was in the end treated as a sympathetic figure. In much the same way, George Schaller's and Diane Fossey's first-hand observations and sensitive depictions of real-life gorillas in the 1970s and 80s transformed the species' reputation from that of vicious aggressors to shy and peaceful victims of a world gone bad. Just where gorillas stood in the grand scheme of life, and what we as humans could learn from studying them, was a question many people tried to answer in the years following Du Chaillu's first introduction of the species to the public in 1859. Here we see a gorilla objecting to any suggestion that he might be related to humankind. Of course, Charles Darwin is the bearded gentleman in the top hat who is causing the gorilla such grief. In the 1870s, popular public speakers like the American naturalist William Denton cited gorillas as the missing link between modern humans and more primitive forms of life. Interestingly, as his promotional poster here suggests, Denton saw Australian Aborigines as filling a roughly similar spot on the human family tree. In the 20th century, as parts of West Africa became more easily accessible, more and more people with an interest in gorillas traveled there to see what they could see and what they could bring home. Some did it for the adventure. Some did it with serious scientific intent. Somewhere in between were the collectors who represented the natural history museums of the world. Their mission, like Du Chaillu's, was usually to secure specimens for public display. Seeing pictures of collecting expeditions from the 1920s and 30s from today's perspective can be quite upsetting. The quasi-charm of 19th century wood engravings is lost to the harsh reality of photographic documentation. Mysterious but intelligent creatures, as described so evocatively by Du Chaillu, have become big game trophies. The only thing positive to be said about the collecting of the 1920s and 30s is that the specimens were generally better preserved and presented to the public than those of Du Chaillu's era. This is a gorilla specimen from the late 1850s, as it was received at the London Zoo, immersed in a keg of brandy. And this is how most specimens were displayed from Du Chaillu's day up until the 1920s and even the 30s, when more modern forms of taxidermy began to replace the old straw and sawdust techniques of the Victorian age. This sequence of pictures documents the preparation of a mounted specimen for a diorama at the Academy of Natural Sciences in the 1930s. You can see here a team of taxidermists sculpting the muscles and then stretching the skin over the sculpted form. And here's the final mount as it still appears today. Interestingly, although it was mounted in 1930, almost 3/4 of a century after Du Chaillu's first specimens were displayed in Philadelphia, New York, and London, the posture for this gorilla was based on one of the plates from Du Chaillu's first book, Explorations and Adventures in Equatorial Africa, for Du Chaillu was still recognized as the authority on the subject of gorilla behavior. His position as the world's gorilla expert would not be challenged for at least 75 years. It's worth noting that the classic Du Chaillu-inspired posture with the arm of the dominant male extended to a tree limb was also used in the Melbourne Museum mount of 1865. In the 1920s, a man named Carl Akeley emerged from the museum world to become infatuated with gorillas. This American naturalist and exhibition designer for the American Museum of Natural History in New York ultimately lost his life creating what some people consider the greatest public monument to the gorilla, this magnificent diorama of the mountain gorilla, which still oozes vitality some 80 years after it was made. It has become iconic, appearing on everything from dust jackets of books to fundraising advertisements for the museum. While this and the other great dioramas in Akeley Hall at the American Museum may be Carl Akeley's most visible legacy, there's a little-known and rarely exhibited sculpture created by him that I think may be his most interesting work. It is certainly the most relevant to our topic this afternoon. This is the chrysalis, created in 1924 and submitted by Akeley to the National Academy of Design in New York. In it, Akeley took the demonized other, as described by Du Chaillu, and turned it on its head. The treatment was considered so shocking that the Academy refused to exhibit the piece, just as Fremier's first gorilla sculpture was initially barred from the Paris Salon. In a much more campy way, the same concept was adopted by Hollywood in 1932 when Marlene Dietrich emerged from a gorilla suit to dazzle an American millionaire played by Cary Grant in a film called Blonde Venus. What Hollywood and filmmakers from around the world have done with some of Du Chaillu's original descriptions of gorillas may seem far-fetched, but they're really not so far removed from the way the media and popular press treated Du Chaillu's experiences with gorillas when he first appeared on the world stage in the 1860s. The operating principle for the popular media then, as now, was never to let reality get in the way of a good story. Despite his subsequent explorations in Scandinavia and a series of critically acclaimed and commercially successful books on that part of the world, Du Chaillu would be pegged as the man who discovered the gorilla for the rest of his life. He died in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1903 while researching a book about that country and its people. Du Chaillu's international celebrity soon faded, and while the explorer himself was more or less forgotten, his discoveries and colorful descriptions were not. I'm currently working on a book with two friends and colleagues, Janet Brown and Jordan Goodman. Our book will discuss Paul Du Chaillu in some detail, but is more broadly focused on the social and political impact of the discovery of the gorilla. In light of the current debate about evolution in the United States and the upcoming anniversary of Darwin's birth and the publication of On Origin of Species in 2009, we hope that our book which is tentatively entitled Too Close for Comfort, will be of interest. We invite you to keep an eye out for it, as it will be published sometime in the next several years. In the meantime, whenever you see a gorilla in a zoo, in a movie, or in an advertisement, I hope you'll remember our time here together this afternoon and think of the diminutive and now all but forgotten French-American explorer who, for better or worse, introduced the world to this marvelous creature a century and a half ago. Let us all hope that in another 150 years, the wild gorillas that so impressed Paul Du Chaillu, Emmanuel Fremier, Carl Akeley, and others are still with us to inspire new generations of explorers, naturalists, and artists to a deeper reverence for life.
Thank you very much, Bob. That was fascinating. In a weird coincidence, I actually had seen the diorama in Melbourne.
Yes.
We lived there for 3 years, and we're very close to the museum, actually, which had just finished some renovations.
It's a wonderful museum.
It's a wonderful museum.
And as you know, people still love to look at that
yeah,
diorama.
my kid. Well, I only had one child back then, but Madeline just loved it. I mean, she was transfixed by it.
And it's hard to believe it's been there that long. I think it is great testament to the taxidermists who put it together.
Yeah, we have a few of the arsenic-treated specimens in our archives. They hold up very, very well.
They do.
Well, let me remind folks, if you do have a question, please feel free to call it in or email in a question. Bob will be happy to answer any question you may have on gorillas.
Love to talk about
but it was a really rich topic. What drew you personally to be interested in gorillas?
It was actually more Paul Du Chaillu who drew me to this. I work at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, and because they were the organization that sponsored Du Chaillu's first expedition, we had so many of the specimens there that I wanted to know a little bit more about the man who found them. Interestingly, as I mentioned earlier, Du Chaillu realized that the money to be made was on gorillas, not on the other things. So the Academy never got a gorilla from Paul Du Chaillu. He sold them to the British Museum and everywhere else. The Academy thought that since they'd paid for the expedition, they would get one, but somehow it never came our way. We were able to acquire some at a later date. But we have a number of letters from Du Chaillu and actually a little pocket watch that he carried with him on all of his travels. And the only thing that survived, the only piece of scientific equipment that survived his disastrous retreat from Ashangoland on the second expedition. And he has engraved all across the back of it in tiny little detailed engraving. This is the watch I carried with me through Africa and shot gorillas and other wild beasts and so on and so forth. And I'm giving it to my good friend so-and-so. And it's signed and dated Paul Du Chaillu. So it's a fascinating little talisman of a man who loomed large on the public scene for a period of 10, 15 years and now has almost completely faded. I would imagine 99 out of 100 people have never heard the name Paul Du Chaillu.
I first encountered it reading The Descent of Man. There's a fair number of references.
Oh, yes.
In Darwin, who the heck is this Du Chaillu? It's referenced all over the place.
Yeah. And the reason he mentions him is not only that he was dealing with, but he was a household name in those days. So it would be a very easy reference to make, and people would relate to it.
Did he really discover the gorilla? I mean, are there no accounts of gorillas previous to
There
Du
are
Chaillu?
earlier accounts, actually, even from some European sailors from the 17th, 18th century, but all done in the form of hearsay. You know, we understand, much the way we hear about Bigfoot today,
Right.
or Yeti is kind of a mythical creature. And the specimens that were described first in the American Journal, really from the Boston Academy of Sciences in 1847, were based on skulls that had been purchased from native suppliers by missionaries and then sent back to the United States, and some were sent to London, some were sent to Paris, all at about that same time, the 1840s and early 50s. They were purchased more or less as souvenirs, and no one knew anything about what they'd come from. So the first descriptions are really just to describe physically the skull, and it's Du Chaillu who gives the lively accounts of their behavior.
But he wasn't able to keep any live specimens alive?
He wasn't. He tried hard to do it, and it was just this misunderstanding about what they were supposed to eat. I think the reason the first male that was shipped survived at least halfway across the Atlantic was it was just a very powerful animal, and it slowly starved to death, but it could live for a couple of weeks. Whereas the female who had a nursing young at the time didn't have the energy reserves to be able to survive. Later in the 19th century, there was one that was successfully sent to a German zoo, and they fed it on beer for quite a while, which the Germans thought was very funny, and the national drink, and how this is really a fun-loving animal. The reason is the poor gorilla was starving for some kind of plant material, and the hops and the flavor of the beer was enough to remind it of what real food should be.
But that was so amusing. I forgot what my next question was, maybe, but that is a great story. So Du Chaillu hadn't actually observed them eating in the wild.
No, he hadn't. And in fact, this was the problem. He and all of the business with the chest beating and all that, which we know does happen, and the descriptions from George Schaller and Diane Fossey indicate that when a big silverback male is threatened, he will come out, and that's his defensive display. Du Chaillu, which is pretty good proof that Du Chaillu did encounter them in the wild. That's the only reason he would have had a chance to see that. But he never waited long enough to see the rest of the behavior, and probably the big male would have retreated, and he could have perhaps followed the group. Instead, he saw this as understandably, a very threatening thing, and would shoot it. And then, of course, that added to his tales of heroism, self-promotional tales of heroism, which were so popular in Victorian times.
How did they capture the live ones then that they tried to transport?
The live ones were done in I think in nets and snares. I mean, it was all pretty gruesome and quite hard on the animals. But the local people had figured out how to do it by knowing where they walked and where the food supplies were. They would put nets down on the ground and hide them in the leaves and so on, and then pull them up.
You mentioned Darwin and some of the other folks speculating on where the gorilla might fit into the human lineage. Did Du Chaillu ever speculate on that?
Interestingly not. He was smart enough to realize that he didn't have the scientific credentials to really make any substantive comment on either anatomy or evolution. So he preferred to drop to the background and allow people like Owen and Edward Gray to fight it out in public, and they took the opportunity. I mean, it really worked to everyone's advantage. And of course, the more it was discussed and debated, the more popular Du Chaillu's books were and his lectures were. So it was kind of a win-win for everyone. They all got a lot of press out of it.
Tell us a little more about the pygmies. This is the first I heard that he discovered.
Well, he traveled to areas where the pygmies were and actually had very good relations with them. And so when he came back from his second trip, having come back from the first trip with descriptions of huge primates, then he came back from the second trip with descriptions of small people, everyone thought, now this is really stretching the credibility too far. But in fact, other explorers who went to the same area, and some specifically followed Du Chaillu's tracks to try to disprove him. There was a man named Reed in particular who made a whole expedition to Africa at his own expense just to try to prove that Du Chaillu had been wrong. Much to their surprise, discovered that the pygmies did exist as a large group of people, and from that point on they were well documented in the literature. But Du Chaillu's accounts of native people are really quite sympathetic for their time. You do get many terrible racist descriptions from other African explorers, but Du Chaillu was pretty supportive, and it's partly because he got to know them as individuals. He traveled with them. Unlike the large expeditions that Stanley and Livingston and these others had with huge teams, Du Chaillu usually traveled alone. I mean, he called it alone, meaning he was the only white person, but he was accompanied by native people who without whom he could never have made his trips. So he got to know them, and then one group would take him to meet and introduce another. They'd get as far as the border and then pass him on, and he'd have to learn that new language. And so he really, although he was not an anthropologist in any modern day sense of that word, he was a keen observer, and he had the opportunity to see native peoples living as they lived, and not fleeing from a military expedition, which is how many other white explorers described them.
You did a wonderful job talking about the misperceptions that he and taxidermy helped promote. Did they actually persist until Schaller and Diane Fossey and some of these folks?
They did, and it's surprising if you look at gorilla mounts in dioramas and museum displays around the world, as I have done in the process of this project. Almost all of them are shown. The male is almost always shown beating his chest or in some very threatening kind of a posture, and there are even ones that were done in the late 19th century that were based directly on his illustrations. I showed some with the arm extended for the male, but the famous engraving of the man lying on the ground and the gorilla taking his gun and biting the barrel. I have actually seen taxidermied mounts of that without the human, but with the gun in the hand being chewed and bent, and sculptures of that same subject. So it became a sort of iconic image, which then translated into even museum displays.
How about Tarzan? What if Du Chaillu is in Tarzan?
And Tarzan's, a lot of that behavior, the beating of the chest and the kind of stuff, you can find the descriptions directly in Du Chaillu, but also all the ancillary things. Burroughs used descriptions of the other wildlife in the area and the descriptions of the jungle. And then there were a whole series. You remember the later films in the 50s and 60s, like Ramar, the jungle, and so on. It became a kind of a cliche of this thick, jungly environment. And in those films, of course, totally wrong from a natural history point of view, they would show lions and sometimes tigers and lions together fighting it out, and total disregard for any reality. But a lot of these were based on the Du Chaillu descriptions, which were so evocative in their day.
What about King Kong, which is really a bizarre film as regards wildlife, both?
Oh yes, well, the coexistence. but there were people like Jules Verne and Arthur Conan Doyle had images themselves of dinosaurs living, particularly in South America, in the Lost World and all that. This sense that if you could get far enough away from civilization, you would find a place that time forgot. And Cooper, of the Cooper and Shostak team that created King Kong, acknowledged in his own autobiography that he had read Du Chaillu as a boy. He was fascinated by Du Chaillu, and from the moment he read Adventures in Africa, he wanted to be an explorer himself, and particularly go to Africa. And his imagery in King Kong, if not modeled on the wording in the book, is certainly inspired by the spirit of Du Chaillu's travels.
Now, you showed a lot of Darwin, and you're working with Janet Brown, one of the best biographers on Darwin. But it seems like the gorilla is used both by evolutionists and anti-evolutionists.
Well, that was what was so interesting. In its day, they were able to kind of argue both sides, and both seized upon this as the chance to prove. Now, Owen tried to do it by showing physically how different the gorilla was from the human, whereas Huxley and Gray both tried to show how similar. And they would pick certain parts of the anatomy and exploit either the similarities or the differences. Darwin, for some reason, chose not to get involved in this particular discussion. He allowed Huxley to do most of the heavy lifting for him when it came to public debate. But even in his writing, he, although, as you say, in The Descent of Man, he refers to Du Chaillu, he didn't actually take a stand on where the gorilla fit into the scheme of things. I guess he figured his plate was full enough with controversy that was one area he didn't need to go in. And it was also, again, a little bit beyond his scope of knowledge. The anatomy issues on which so much of this debate hinged were a little bit beyond his personal experience and his expertise. And he was wise enough not to weigh in on something that he could be criticized for later.
It is very complex. Was the gorilla by the evolutionists perceived as this ancient lineage, or?
It was certainly. I think the whole family of primates became of great interest to them, and how each related to the other. And to have one more, particularly so large and conspicuous a one, emerge on the scene at just that time was a fascinating thing. Interestingly, some of this discussion continues today. Now we have DNA and other modern techniques to explain and understand better our relationships. And gorillas are quite close to us, of course, from a molecular point of view, as are chimpanzees and
Sure.
so on. But it quickly crosses over from a scientific debate to a theological and a political debate.
You brought up to the present. Let me ask you one last question. You're very acute at observing cultural perceptions of wildlife and so on. What do you think the current perceptions are of gorillas compared to a century ago?
I thankfully, because of Dian Fossey and George Schaller, I think the world has taken a 180-degree turn, and that for most people, gorillas, even though they're used still in cartoons and in advertising as symbols of strength, they are also the poster animals for environmental degradation and political instability around the world, because we know now that a lot of the poaching that is occurring is because of political conflict and economic hardships in parts of West Africa. Let's hope that those areas can return to a more peaceful way of life and that the animals will be protected.
Well, usually I go out by asking what your next project is, but I think you already told us.
Well, I'm working actually at the moment on a project on Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, the British naturalist, contemporary of Du Chaillu and the rest of the people I've mentioned today, who was an illustrator for Charles Darwin and the first man to create life-size sculptures of dinosaurs. Wow. He did this for the Crystal Palace in 1854, and surprisingly, no one had attempted it before. He then came to America and was commissioned to create a great paleontological museum in Central Park, which sadly never came to pass.
That's fascinating. Well, perhaps you'll come back and tell us about that. I've heard about the, I didn't know Hawkins' name, but the Crystal Palace dinosaurs are quite famous, and there's many nice illustrations of those.
And he too was associated with the Academy of Natural Sciences in that he did the first articulated dinosaur display in any museum in the world for the Academy in 1868.
Well, Robert, thank you so much, and we appreciate those of you who took the time to tune in, and I think this is a very stimulating and fascinating history of the gorilla up to the present, so thank you very much. Our next broadcast will be December 13th, when we're going to have Sandra Burke talking about restoring the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So thank you all very much.